Welcome to Part D. Say the word Amiga, and only a handful of game developers spring to mind. The one that for most would be top of the list was the fantastic Bitmap Brothers. Back in 1986, Mike Montgomery, a marketing manager of Leisure Genius, which were famous for their board game conversions, would, whilst doing a re-release of the game Scrabble by Scion Software, meet Steve Kelly, a programmer of the original Scion Scrabble release. Both would also meet Eric Matthews, who would convert Steve's game QL Karate onto the Amiga and Atari ST. All three of them were becoming disillusioned by the game industry's focus on the publisher. It seemed crazy. I mean, you go into a music shop and say you want to buy some music by Apple Records. Of course you don't. You go into a music shop and say I want music by the Beatles. The same with films. So the trio couldn't see why video games should be any different. Now that they'd decided to create their own development house, they needed a name. They decided on Bitmap Brothers, with Bitmap describing the importance of the graphics, and Brothers denoting the brotherhood feel that they wanted to give between their team. So, in 1987, the trio bravely left their jobs and set up a new company, each working from home and only meeting in a pub in Wapping, East London once a week, that would include drunk trips to the local arcade. Their first game that they would develop was a shooter called Kelly X, which thankfully at last minute they changed to the much cooler sounding name Xenon in 1988. This was a overhead free scrolling blaster that was well received at the time. It was at this time that they also had lots of PR photos of the trio showing themselves in cool shade, so they would look like rock stars. The game magazines loved it and were happy to show the trio's pictures in their mags, and so that helped shape the developers in the gamers' minds, as opposed to the publishers. For their second game, the Bitmap Brothers were commissioned to do a tennis game whilst writing Xenon. Unfortunately, the publishers changed their mind, leaving the guys with a wasted game design effort. Dejected, the boys went down to their local pub to drown their sorrows. And during this drinking session, they sketched out on the back of a cigarette packet the idea of a futuristic sports game instead, turning the game into Speedball, which was released in 1988. The publishers loved the game concept much more and signed them up there and then. Loosely based on the 1970s film Rollerball, it had you hurl a metallic ball around to each of the players to finally score a goal against the opponent, or by bashing your opponent in this no-rule sport. As good as those games were, it was nothing to the games that would follow. In 1989, the brothers decided to do a sequel to the hit Xenon with Xenon 2 Mega Blast, an amazing sequel that was an arcade-fueled vertical blaster totally different from the original Xenon game. The game was actually coded by assembly line developers, but the graphics and design was still handled by Bitmap Brothers, and it had you fly your craft in 5 levels of blasting mayhem action. It was in this game that Bitmap Brothers, knowing that the music and sound in their previous games was their weakest area, did a deal with record label Rhythm King to help produce the music. This brought on board Tim Simonon from Bomb the Bass to use their tune Mega Blast as the game's music. This was the first time that this had actually happened in a game, and to have a proper composer really helped complete the package, with the music still being what people most remember about the Xenon 2 game. Their next release was an in-depth isometric adventure called Kadaava. This was released in 1990 and was a great game stacked full of ingenious puzzles and a total departure from Bitmap Brothers' normal arcade frantic action. In 1991, a data disc was also released called Kadaava The Payoff, which continued the puzzle-solving adventure. But in November 1990, the Bitmap Brothers would come out with what many consider their best game to date, with Speedball 2, Brutal Deluxe. This took everything that was great about the original, but turned it all up to 11 to offer the ultimate futuristic brawling action. This was also a big departure from the first game, turning the claustrophobic arena of the original into being replaced by a much bigger arena, in the second. This new arena also had multiple ways of scoring, as you could hit stars on the side as well as score in the opponent's goal. I, as many, adore this game, with it hitting the perfect balance of skill and action, offering a great two-player experience as well as a one-player. It also had the great music by Nation 12. But the Bitmap Brothers were still under the control of publishers, namely Microsoft's Image Work label, which was run by the Suits that were still only interested in money. Martin Heath, a big gamer and also head of Rhythm King Records, who had agreed to licensing music before, decided to join forces with Bitmap Brothers to create a new publishing label called Renegade. This label would be all about the developer and the quality of the games, with money being secondary. This wonderful new philosophy would not only ensure all future Bitmap Brother games would be released under its label, but would attract many other classic developers, such as Sensible Software. Sadly, Renegade would only last until 1995, when it was sold off, and the label would be completely dropped in 1997. But back to March 1991, and by now the Bitmap Brothers seemed to be gods of the gaming world. And so it is fitting that their next game was the ancient Greek platformer called Gods. This had you play Hercules on a quest to make your way through the lost city and destroy the 4 guardians so that you can become immortal. This was a really polished platform adventure with nice puzzles and gorgeous graphics. Next was the rather polished but bland platformer Magic Pockets, released in October 1991. This had you play the Bitmap Kid, who by putting his hands in his pockets can make his trousers bulge. However, our little chap has in fact magic pockets and reveals whirlwinds to attack the surrounding beasties. The game was polished, but with the dark, moody bitmap graphics looking out of place on the cutesy-themed world. The game did also include the music by Betty Boo doing the do, which was quite a nice addition. Finally, the Bitmap Brothers would release the classic Gauntlet-inspired blaster called Chaos Engine in 1993. It was called Soldiers of Fortune in the US. This time, the bitmaps were in familiar territory again, and setting the game in a steampunked Victorian setting was a fantastic idea, and had you control 1 or 2 madcap characters as they go around trying to destroy the Chaos Engine machine that had been built and turned all the local inhabitants into slobbering monsters. One of the nice touches with the game was that if you played one player, then the computer would take control of the second player, meaning you would always have a partner to join in on the action. The bitmaps would continue with Chaos Engine 2 in 1996, which would only work on souped-up Amigas, and it was also released on the SNES. After the Amiga, they would continue with the forgotten gem called Z, but their golden era and their time with the Amiga would be over.
Yes, sir.
Dino Dini should be a man first thought of for every video game football fan, as he was instrumental force behind publisher Anko in revolutionising how video football games played. Back in 1989, Kickoff was released, and what was so revolutionary about the game was that it no longer had the ball glued to the player's feet, but it would realistically play ahead of the player. By 1990, he would refine everything about the game to perfection with its sequel, Kickoff 2. I adore everything about this game, and along with Sensible Soccer, they are my 2 favourite football games ever released. Dino also released in 1990 the Player Manager series, a great companion game that allowed you not only to play Kickoff essentially, but manage your team to victory as well. By 1992, Dino would leave Anko, meaning that the subsequent Kickoff games would be poor follow-ons from the Dino Classic series. However, Dino would release his version of Kickoff 3 in all but name under the title Goal, published by Virgin. The refined game still added further to Kickoff 2 with more gameplay tightening and the ability to tweak almost any element of your team. Back in 1989, Infogrames would release a brilliant game called North and South, which was based on the Belgian comic Les Tuniques Blues. and it was set in the Civil War of America. Much like Cinemaware games before, the game would be a mixture of sub-games which must be completed to progress in the game. There was a real-time battlefield sub-game, capturing the fort and robbing the train. The game was great fun, especially in two-player, and the French-Belgian humour of the comics comes shining through with every pixel of the artwork. That's the end of Part D, please go on to Part E.